you could basically think of this as universal basic fellowships for PhD students, because I think the dynamics that come with it very, very closely would match what it would be if you were getting a fellowship of the same size.
Welcome to the Personal Finance for PhDs podcast, a higher education in personal finance. I'm your host, Dr. Emily Roberts. This is Season 6, Episode 2, and today my guest is Dr. Jim Pugh, the founder of ShareProgress and co-host of the Basic Income podcast. In this second half of our interview, Jim articulates what basic income is and how it would alleviate poverty in the United States, including results from recent research and experimentation. He describes the possible avenues by which it could be funded and whether it would replace our existing social safety nets. We speculate about how basic income might affect higher education, including PhD stipends and postdoc salaries. Without further ado, here's the second part of my interview with Dr. Jim Pugh. We're back now with part 2 of my interview with Dr. Jim Pugh. In part 1, he told us all about how he started a business a few years after graduate school, which ultimately allowed him a great deal of time freedom. So his business pays for his lifestyle, but he only works at this point about 5 hours a week on the business. And that has allowed him to pivot to his advocacy work around universal basic income, which is what we're going to be hearing a lot more about today. So Jim, thank you so much for continuing this interview with me. And we want to start off with a basic question about universal basic income, because frankly, I probably would not have really heard about this except that you and I are Facebook friends. And also we're recording this in September 2019, and Andrew Yang is a candidate for the Democratic nomination for president. So between those two things, I've kind of heard a little bit about basic income, but I would love to hear a lot more about what it actually is from you.
Sure. Well, so just to start with the definition, a universal basic income it's a policy that would provide every single person in the country with unconditional cash payments regularly. Most people talk about once a month. That's actually enough to cover basic needs. And the idea of it is that you are basically, if you were to enact this, you eradicate absolute poverty. You're ensuring that everyone does have enough money to cover the fundamentals. And so in some ways, it's very, very simple because it's just giving people some cash. But in other ways, we're potentially talking about something very radical, because we would, for the first time, be saying, we are fully abolishing absolute poverty. We're saying that absolutely no one in the country should be poor, and that we're going to structure our systems with that in mind. And so the ramifications of that are pretty profound as far as what does it mean for work, what does it mean for health, what does it mean for people's general lifestyle, if you're actually establishing that fundamental financial security floor.
Okay, so let's first take the benefits, the upsides of this, and let's leave aside for the moment the practicalities of it, but just to talk about the vision for what the society might be like. So what are the benefits that people might experience, maybe who are currently in poverty but would be lifted out of that through UBI? You started to talk about this a little bit at the end of the last episode. So there's actually been research done in this area, and there's been some experimentation. So can you talk a little bit about what we know already about how this might change things for people?
Yeah, so I think there's the obvious things that we know. When people are poor, they can't afford food, or at least healthy food. They may be having trouble finding somewhere to live. They may not be able to take care of themselves. So if you're actually ensuring that everyone is up above the poverty line through just regular cash transfers, those are all things that are addressed, first order effects. But I think beyond that, that's where things start to get quite interesting, because we have seen more and more evidence around how poverty and financial insecurity, if not causing, at least are greatly contributing to a lot of other issues that we're dealing with today. And so people, when they are approaching any aspect of their life, they can either be in an abundance mentality where they think, okay, I have enough, I can think bigger picture, or a scarcity mentality where they feel constrained, which basically gives people tunnel vision, that they're only thinking about what's right in front of them. And that difference has huge impacts on what happens to people. So first off, there's been studies just looking at general intelligence, and there's a substantial shift in people's IQ level between those two different headspaces. That you're, I think it's around 1 standard deviation, so about 10 IQ points smarter when you're in an abundance mindset as opposed to a scarcity mindset. So you're making better decisions. Second, as I said, when you get that tunnel vision, and so it means you're just thinking about what's right in front of you, it basically prevents you from long-term planning. You can't be thinking about what is my life going to be even a year, but much less 5-10 years down the road, if you're worried about, oh, how am I going to put food on the table tonight or tomorrow? And so it allows people and encourages people to plan better, to make better long-term decisions, which has big impacts around choices on education, choices around what sort of work they pursue, and ultimately where they do end up in that 5, 10 years down the road. And so, and yeah, there's beyond just being able to afford health treatments, there's also a lot of evidence that when you're in a scarcity mindset, when you're in poverty, it's extremely damaging for mental health, and also for physical health. Stress has an impact on that as well. Crime, strong correlation based on people's financial security as to whether they're more or less likely to commit crimes. And so there's all these second and third order implications around how things would look in our society if we weren't to have this absolute poverty. That seems incredibly promising. And so that's why, again, our typical approach as a society is to, when something is going wrong, to treat the symptoms of it. And this instead is really saying, let's actually try to take a step back, deal with some of the underlying causes, and see how much easier that makes dealing with all the rest of the stuff.
Okay. Sounds amazing. Sounds very, very compelling. I'm wondering a little bit more about what the vision for what this society may look like should we bring it about. You talked earlier about jobs. And so is the idea that not as many people would need to work, there wouldn't necessarily be as many people in jobs, or is the idea that you would have just more freedom and flexibility around when you want to work and when you want to, have further training? Like, how does this relate to the jobs, I guess, is what I'm asking.
I think much more the latter. So the idea is not that this is something that's going to replace jobs wholesale. I think it does allow you to pursue a more general definition of work, I would say. And so in the sense that job right now means a fairly specific thing in most conversations about more like a 9-to-5, like ongoing consistent workplace, this does give you additional flexibility to think a bit differently about what is the right form of work for you to be doing. So that's whether that's part-time, whether that's taking some time to get more of an education in an area that ultimately is going to allow you to do something that you feel better about and maybe much more productive for society. Whether it's going to give you the flexibility if you want to do some sort of family care, staying home with children or elderly folks. And if another one is entrepreneurship. If you're considering starting a company or doing something that in its early stages may not be giving you a steady paycheck, having more flexibility around that as well. So it opens up all these doors that most folks, I would say, don't really have access to at this point in time. As far as overall impact on how much people are working, there's actually been a number of studies on this, and what it suggests is the results vary. That there are certain situations where when you give people regular unconditional cash, they work more. That it seems like either through stimulating the local economy and creating jobs, or by giving people that flexibility, they end up doing more work. So Alaska, for the last 40 years, has actually had a universal income provided by oil in the state. And recent studies have found that the overall work rate hasn't changed, but you see a lot more people engaging in part-time work than you have in the past. For certain groups, studies have found there is a decrease in work, but quite consistently actually across studies. The ones where that's only really stood out is parents with young children and teenagers, basically. And interviewing folks involved in that, it seems like the former is spending more time staying home with kids, the latter is spending more time at school. So it's again, it's not captured as work in how we measure it today, but it actually is work, and potentially much more pro-social work than they might otherwise be engaged in.
So this is really reminding me of, so I have not read this book. The book is Your Money or Your Life, by Vicki Robbins, I want to say, and she has a co-author. Anyway, I heard a podcast interview with her within the last few weeks, and she was talking about how in our current society, like you're saying, like there's a lot of work that is not inside a job, right? There's a lot of work that people do in our society to further it. A lot of women do this kind of work, and it's not valued in terms of a paycheck from a job, right? That doesn't mean it's not contributing to society. And
Yeah.
so I don't remember if they specifically talked about basic income on that podcast, but this is a way to sort of reframe what counts as work and what counts as doing something valuable with your time. Yeah. Okay. So I think I'm getting you here. I have another question around how this would this like replace the social safety nets that we have currently and expand them, I guess you could say.
So there are mixed opinions on this amongst people who advocate for basic income. I'm actually in the camp saying that this should not initially be treated as a replacement for any social programs. And I think the reasons are, so one is that I think there is widespread recognition across the political spectrum that our social safety net is not working as well as we would like it to. You get very different opinions as to what would allow it to work as well as we would like it to. But people, yeah, no one is satisfied with where it's at. I think a lot of people have talked about let's provide basic income and then just cut much, if not all, of other social programs because this will eradicate absolute poverty. Why do we need to worry about anything else? And there's actually, I would say, a lot of edge cases here where it's people who are dealing with some specific challenge for which cash on its own is not going to completely solve it. It will help a lot in many situations, but I think there is the risk that if you say, all right, we'll get rid of this other stuff and just give you cash, you've basically taken a problem that requires multiple parts to solve and just replace one part with another, and argue in some cases maybe leaving people worse off because of that.
Can you
Yeah.
be more specific about what is being provided to people now that's not money?
Yeah. So I think disability being a good one, where disability can look very different for different sorts of people, and in some cases, the support you would need to actually be able to live with disabilities requires much more than what a basic income would provide. And so that's a case where if someone were to say, we're going to wipe everything off the books and just give you that, a lot of people in that situation are going to be left far worse off. I think there's specific issues around addiction. In some situation, housing assistance, where obviously there's areas where housing is far, far more expensive. And so to think that a national UBI would actually be enough for people in the Bay Area to be able to get by, it's not realistic. And so that's a situation where a targeted intervention beyond the UBI is going to be important. And then I think there's other ones where it may be some general challenge where someone's fallen out of the workforce or coming back from deployment abroad, where again, cash, making sure that they have enough cash is important, but there's additional services that come beyond that that also much better set them up to succeed than the cash on its own. And so I think that's a key thing here, is to recognize both how transformative and valuable UBI could be, but also that it's not a panacea, it's not a silver bullet, it's something that will need an ecosystem of additional supports if we actually want to have an effective safety net. And so I don't think the safety net we have right now is doing that well enough, and we need to be rethinking that. But I think that there's a danger when people say UBI instead of that we throw the baby out with the bathwater and end up in a situation where people may be much worse off than they are today.
Yeah, I think because this is, I don't necessarily want to say it's a new idea. I mean, you said Alaska has been doing something like this for 40 years, but it's gained maybe national attention only in recent years. So this is still an idea that's being worked out at the policy level. We don't know exactly if viable, we don't know exactly what the ultimate, solution would look like, and presumably it would change over decades and generations anyway. So I'm glad you brought up like the cost of living question because yeah, the US is very diverse in terms of cost of living. Is the ultimate idea still that people would get the same amount of money no matter where they live? Maybe with some additional help, like you were just saying, and for certain people in certain areas?
Yeah. So that's a key part of it is, and I don't think I said in my original definition, but the idea is this would be the same amount to everyone. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is logistical, that it becomes much easier to manage if it's the same for everyone. But the other is more psychological. One of the reasons for taking a universal approach is to try to eliminate stigma associated with receiving support, which in our modern age, we all see how much stigma is associated with receiving various forms of welfare, and that if it's something that everyone in society is getting, you're able to get around that, because why is it wrong for the homeless person on the street to get the check every month if I'm also getting my check every month? And so that's another reason to have the equal universal amount. But as you say, what that means is that particularly in different regions across the country, you're going to see big differences as far as the implications of that. So there certainly are parts of the country where if you were giving everyone $1,000 a month, you could survive without too much difficulty. If you're in the Bay Area or other places, that does not get you very far. And so that's an area where you do need to have something beyond that. There's been some discussion around regional supplements where you might be able to top up equal federal amount with something that it goes up more for more expensive areas. But I think beyond that, yeah, there may be other targeted interventions that are important. I think one question that comes up that we don't really have a good answer to, but people wonder about is if you're providing a basic income to everyone, it is going to increase people's mobility. And so if you currently feel tied to a certain geography for economic reasons, which may be very expensive, whether that gives you the option to relocate to somewhere that is less expensive. I think that gets very complicated because it goes into community ties and family and things like that, where there may be other drivers beyond just the economics of it. But it's something that would be different if we did this, and so potentially that at least partially would help to mitigate some of those challenges.
Emily here for a brief interlude. I'd bet you and your peers are hungry for financial information right now, especially if it's tailored for your unique PhD experience. I offer seminars, webinars, and workshops on personal finance for early career PhDs that can be billed as professional development or personal wellness programming. My events cover a wide range of personal finance topics, or take a deep dive into the financial topics that matter most to PhDs, like taxes, investing, career transitions, and frugality. If you're interested in having me speak to your group or recommending me to a potential host, you can find more information and ways to contact me at pfforphds.com/speaking. We can absolutely find a way to get this great content to you and your peers, even while social distancing. Now back to our interview. I feel like I could continue asking you questions about this for quite a long time. It's a good thing you have a podcast where other people can learn more about this. What is the name of your podcast?
Our name is a bit on the nose. We are the Basic Income Podcast. I've been producing weekly episodes for about 3 years now, and exploring both UBI specifically, but also how it relates and connects to all sorts of other areas.
Okay. So I'm going to hold off on the questions that are still swirling in my head and just say, listeners, if you're excited about this idea or skeptical of it or whatever, go ahead and check out the podcast. And I'm sure, there's other resources that you refer to from there where people can continue to learn even more. So one kind of more question around the vision of this, which is, should we all, or enough of us in the United States, decide this is a good idea? What actually does it look like to fund this? Maybe post transition, if there is a transition?
Yeah, so it's another area where people have very different opinions around, because if we're looking at it on its face, saying, all right, everyone in the country gets $1,000 a month, that's about $4 trillion, which is the size of our current governmental spending, which seems insane. But there's various caveats, I would say, that make it much more achievable than it may seem at a glance. The first is, so my preferred approach to financing is first to recognize that if you're going to enact universal basic income, it means you need to make some significant differences in the tax code. And specifically as a starting point, I think income tax, at its core, the goal of UBI is to provide people with financial security. And so what that means is that, so knowing you're always going to get your check every month is important because who knows what may happen to you. And having it always there gives you that security. But if you're earning a good paycheck, there's no reason why you should be coming out net ahead necessarily. And so to basically update our income tax brackets such that once people make above a certain point, their UBI is effectively being taxed away. So maybe that's 4 times the poverty level. So if you was an individual earning more than $50,000 or $60,000 a year, you wouldn't, basically you'd be getting your check every month and then you'd be paying a bit more in taxes to cover that expense. If you do it that way and look at what was effectively the net cost, it drops to somewhere between $500 billion and $1 trillion a year, which is still a lot, but a lot less than $4 trillion we started with. And so then there's different ideas as to how do you pay for that. That's much more in line with other somewhat ambitious governmental programs. You can couple together some combination of a carbon tax, a financial transaction tax, a wealth tax, since we're talking more about that since Elizabeth Warren brought it up in her campaign, where you're able to raise that amount of money to cover the difference. And also, I think potentially looking at adding a few tax brackets at the top of the income level. If we were to go back to the taxation we had pre-Reagan, that would be bringing in a substantial amount there. So with those things combined, you can relatively easily actually be able to cover the cost.
Okay, very, very interesting. So I wanted to pivot a little bit to tie this really into more of our PhD audience because we haven't brought that up so far, really. I mean, you mentioned earlier that, having a basic income could afford people the flexibility to do more training. Of course, PhDs have a lot of that. Have you given any thought, or has there been any discussion around this? How basic income, I'm sure it's been discussed at the undergraduate level, how that would affect people pursuing college degrees. You can speak about that a little bit if you like, but I am curious about what you think about how it might affect PhD training in the United States. And specifically, you brought up earlier the scarcity mindset and how that prevented people from thinking long term, and it caused an effective IQ drop. And in season 4 of this podcast, I published a 2-part interview with Dr. Lucy Bland, and she talked about her scarcity mindset that she developed during her PhD because she was living in poverty during her PhD. She was funded at a very low level. She lives in a very expensive city. And it's something that a lot of people can relate to during their graduate training. Although you wouldn't necessarily think about graduate students, a relatively privileged bunch, I would expect, necessarily being beneficiaries of basic income, but maybe during that training period they are. Can you just speak a little bit about that?
Well, I would actually just add on to that. What we're seeing in the Bay Area right now is not only at the graduate student level, but actually the assistant professor level in some places that people are homeless. They can't afford to live here, so they're living out of their cars. I think that is it's giving you that layer of financial security, which should help with that. I think not just because it's some extra money, but because it would be extra money not tied to your employment education situation. And obviously this is not everyone, and hopefully a small minority, but if you're having some bad power dynamics with your professor and feeling like you don't want to be working with him or her, but are not able to step away because of financial finances you're receiving from there, it gives you that out of knowing that regardless of what you decide there, you have that income coming in otherwise. So
there's
I think
actually a slight parallel there actually with fellowship income, right? And you did your PhD outside of the States, so maybe it's a little bit different there, but here with fellowship income, it's an award that you receive as an individual. It's based on your own merits. And so it's not necessarily tied to you staying in one person's lab. And so I published an interview in season 4 where someone was able to switch labs, did not have a good relationship with the first advisor, was able to switch labs partially because she received an NSF graduate research fellowship. And so similar situation, right? If you know you can go a few months in transition without a paycheck coming from your advisor, it gives you more freedom there to really seek out the situation that's going to support you best as a developing researcher. So yeah, excellent point there. Please continue.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, I think you just nailed it, that you could basically think of this as universal basic fellowships for PhD students. Because I think that, yeah, I think the dynamics that come with it very, very closely would match what it would be if you were getting a fellowship of the same size. I mean, obviously with the added flexibility that you could leave the PhD program and still have it, but as far as a context within graduate school, I think that's basically what it would be.
Just to explore that a little bit further,
Yeah.
because I do think it's a good analogy. So one of the great things about fellowship income is that it gives you more freedom in your research, right? So if you're not beholden to working on a specific grant for your advisor, like you often are in STEM fields if you have a research assistantship, the fellowship allows you more intellectual flexibility in pursuing projects that are more in line with your own goals. It allows you to pursue collaborations. It's just a greater degree of freedom. Now, some advisors, exact more or less control when they do have people on a grant for research assistantships. That's sort of up to their discretion. But yeah, so like the flexibility there in terms of your intellectual pursuits would then translate in terms of UBI into your general career pursuits, life pursuits. It would just be a much broader funding of that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that I could imagine there would also be kind of a trade-off on that versus greater financial security, because one of the questions would be, if everyone were getting a basic income, would you still have PhD student stipends and outside fellowships at a similar level? If you would, okay, everyone's going to be much more economically stable.
You said earlier as like a touch point that around, in your vision of this, around $50,000 or $60,000 of income, that's when the UBI would kind of phase out. And for the graduate student level, graduate students don't reach that point. A lot of postdocs don't reach that point. So, it in some sense, if nothing changed on the grant side of things, then it would boost your income. But yes, the question is whether people would still be funded to the same degree, given that they had that baseline. So if the idea right now in academia is we give people just enough money to live on so they don't have to have other jobs that distract from their PhD research, well, then maybe they would just decrease that funding. So yeah, any other thoughts around that? I'm sure this has not been very fully explored because it's a very niche interest.
Well, no, I think that it's a specific example of something that is much broader, which is basically what is, if we were to have UBI, what does that do to wages? And the theory is that it depends a lot on what type of work you're talking about and how much there is the internal versus external motivation around doing that work. Because if someone's only doing the work because they're getting paid to do it, UBI actually has the potential to then increase wages, because it basically gives them more leverage to say like, oh, well, I don't actually like this work. I'm going to go pursue other options. And a company might then have to say, oh, well, instead of $8 an hour, we're going to pay you $15 an hour. On the flip side, if it's something people just want to be doing for other reasons, like perhaps going to graduate school, since not too many people go to graduate school to get rich, then there's the opposite potential, where if someone is basically willing to do it, assuming they won't be starving, then universities may say, okay, well, you're UBI now. Instead of giving you 18,000 a year, we're going to give you 6. So, and then I mean, it's a whole other topic, but I would say that's where unions might come in handy. But yeah, I think it's one of those areas that it's very, very difficult to answer and know exactly what will happen until we actually do it. So we can hypothesize around it, but yeah, it's an open question.
Yeah, I guess I'm also thinking about sort of we're having larger debates and angst in academia around the value of teaching, right? Because there's this huge adjunct workforce that is, severely underpaid. They don't have job security. And yet such a huge percentage of the classes that undergraduates and graduate students take are being taught by people who are not full-time employees of the institution that they work for or institutions. And it's such a difficult area right now. I can definitely see how UBI would help people in that situation, right? Because they are also experiencing poverty or near poverty, situations, many of them. But yeah, what does it do to, I mean, we're in a transition point for education broadly. Like, if we're moving to, massive online courses and so forth, maybe fewer teachers are needed. I don't know. There's just a lot of transition here. I guess when we're talking about maybe some kinds of jobs disappearing or transitioning, teaching at the higher education level is one of those jobs that is like sort of in transition, the workforce is.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, UBI is just kind of another element to kind of throw into the mix here that we don't really know how it's going to play out entirely.
Yeah, I think that's right. And this applies less. I would say I would expect it to still apply to some degree, but on the flip side, as far as what is the responsibility of the teacher versus the student, I think certainly at the elementary and high school level, there's ample evidence that financial stability of the family the student's coming from makes a big difference as far as how well they're able to learn. And so that's, I would say, another wrinkle that gets thrown in here as well, where if you are ensuring that everyone who is in the class is in more of an abundance mindset, what implications does that have to what is the most effective way at educating?
Such an interesting topic, Jim. I think that people will definitely want to follow up with you and learn more about this, maybe have more discussions with you around, what does the potential of UBI look like and affecting higher education and graduate students and postdocs and trainees. Again, tell us a little bit more about what you do. We have the name of it, but what do you do on your podcast?
Yeah, so we cover a lot of different areas. Most of the most of the episodes, I think, like yours, feature are centered around a guest interview on some topic. And so we've covered everything from, what would UBI do with the disability community, to what's happening in Canada with UBI, to what are digging in on some of the modern controlled pilots that are being done in the US and abroad, to, what is the connection between UBI and housing. And so it really covers a lot of different areas, but generally we bring on an expert, we chat with them, and then we talk through what are the ramifications of what they said, and so really try to dig in a little bit on many different areas.
So actually one follow-up question that goes maybe more back to our earlier conversation with what does this vision look like? Does the implementation of UBI come with it or depend on a revolution within healthcare and also in higher education, paying for higher education?
Yeah, so I would say healthcare comes up a lot, and in my view, the UBI can only truly be successful if we actually have truly universal healthcare, because it basically counts on the assumption that you can somewhat reasonably project what is the cost of living for people across the country. In our current system, if you don't actually have universal coverage, that is impossible. I mean, we see all the time all these cases of people having insane bills for services. And as long as that continues to happen, there's no way to actually guarantee universal financial security. And so I see those two things as very, very complementary and part of a whole package we should be fighting for. I think education, perhaps not quite as closely coupled, but I think if we're talking about what is beyond just financial security, what is really setting people up for the best long-term success, it seems obvious that we want to make that as accessible as possible. And so a model where everyone in society has access to higher education is certainly the way to go.
Gotcha. Okay. Standard question as we wrap up here that I ask all of my guests, which is what is your best financial advice for another PhD? And that could be related to something that we've talked about in these two episodes, or it could be something entirely new.
I mean, I think it's just like figuring out your sustainability. So, I mean, thinking about where you'll be going with your PhD, and what is your cost of living then, but just trying to set yourself up so that you're not heading towards a cliff somewhere, which, I feel like could look very, very different depending on your specifics.
Yeah, definitely. It's something I talk about a lot in for people who are sort of in transition, right? Out of graduate school, out of a postdoc, into other positions, especially when they're moving. Make sure you understand the cost of living, as you brought up
Hmm.
earlier. In San
Yeah,
Francisco, make sure you understand the cost of living that you're getting into,
right.
and that the salary that you've been offered is appropriate for that area, and negotiate if that is not your initial offer. So, thank you so much for that advice, Jen. This has been a fascinating conversation, really just the tip of the iceberg on this topic. And so thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the conversation as well.
Listeners, thank you for joining me for this episode. pfforphds.com/podcast is the hub for the Personal Finance for PhDs podcast. There you can find links to all the episode show notes and a form to volunteer to be interviewed. I'd love for you to check it out and get more involved. If you've been enjoying the podcast, please consider joining my mailing list for my behind-the-scenes commentary about each episode. Register at pfforphds.com/subscribe. See you in the next episode, and remember, you don't have to have a PhD to succeed with personal finance, but it helps. The music is Stages of Awakening by Poddington Bear from the Free Music Archive and is shared under CC by NC. Podcast editing and show notes creation by Miriam Ock.